so we'll start with, there's the 2 chapters to cover today. So the first chapter was the Fairclough chapter, and then the chapter from the book, chapter 4. And let me just double check something here in the chapter. I thought it was. This one, the Fairclough chapter, I feel like is a little bit less dense than the chapter in the book. The article itself was actually published in 1989. It's an older article, so 2013 was the date of publication of the book, but this chapter is kind of an old chapter, and it's got some old examples in it, but nevertheless, it still has some important points in it in terms of language and power. So let's get into those notions a little bit, and then we'll kind of discuss what the implications for language and power are for language teaching. Shannon, can you please do me a favor? Because when I'm sharing my screen, I can't see if a new student is trying to get into the classroom, and I need to give them permission, or I need to admit them. So if you see that somebody's trying to get in, would you please just let me know so I can stop the share and then let them in?
Sure. I don't know if I can, because when you share, it takes up my whole screen. But along the bottom, I see it says participants 2. So maybe if somebody else joins, it'll pop up. If I see it, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. I think it does, because last night the students would let me know when that was happening. So hopefully it will. So if not. Okay, so and is the size of the font okay for you? Can you see it?
Yeah, the share screen is like long and skinny, like it's on a cell phone, but I can see it. I can read it, no problem.
Okay, yes, I am using my cell phone because the wireless connection is not very strong, so it's better if I go on my 4G connection. So I'm doing it from my phone. And I'll post the PowerPoint in the course as soon as we're finished, so you will have access to it. So if you want to increase the size on your own screen, you can do that. I just don't, if I do it here, then stuff will go off the edges and then you'll miss content.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. So, so Fairclough, I mean, basically what he's talking about here is he's going into notions about power and discourse. So we're looking at analyzing discourse, and discourse is usually an exchange in conversation or some type of language. I mean, we talked about this last week, where a piece of discourse might even be like a monologue or a speech or something, but there's still an intended audience, and so there's still some kind of an interaction. So in my mind, at least, the first word that comes when I think of the word discourse, I think of conversation, of back and forth, but it's not always that. It might be large chunks of speech that are considered pieces of discourse. But what he's talking about here is the exchange of power that occurs in this type of exchange of conversation or exchange of words and language. And he's particularly looking at situations where there's an exchange in unequal levels of power. So when one person is in a more superior position and somebody else in a more subordinate position for any different reason, like socioeconomic status or race or gender or job position, or it could be even like height or something like that. Just like even physical presence can cause a change in power structure between two people interacting in discourse, or more than two. And then this effect is hidden. It's not apparent to the naked eye. I mean, we might feel it. We might have a sense that there's an unequal distribution of power, but as with anything in life, if we don't use critical thinking and stop to examine it and think about it, we might just accept things at face value as they are. So like in this chapter, for example, they analyze a couple of pieces of discourse, and they look at the exchange between a doctor and a patient, or between a doctor and a intern in a medical school. And so one might just assume that that's just the way things are. That's how conversations occur in those situations. But when you really stop to analyze and look at it and see what's going on at a deeper level in terms of if there are interruptions or certain kinds of intonation, or even the words that people use, or the lack of conversation also is a huge indicator. So silence, or what is not said, is equally as important in the interpretation. And this is something that we don't usually stop to think about. So whatever words the person used, they chose certain words. And it might have been a very quick and almost subconscious decision, but nevertheless, they made a choice and opted for one word as opposed to another, or one intonation as opposed to another. And the choices that were left unsaid also say something about the power relationship in the discourse between the interlocutors. So there are tactics that the more powerful speaker might be able to use that will inhibit the less powerful speaker from being able to speak. So as I mentioned before, if they interrupt, they certainly take the floor and they don't allow the other person to have a turn. So there are certain strategies that the more powerful person might use that will help them to maintain their position of power in the conversation, and therefore in the situation or in the social structure outside of the conversation. And so they're trying to maintain their position. And so there are certain constraints that are placed on the discourse. And the three main constraints that Fairclough describes are in terms of contents, and that's the actual words that are used, and the content is what is said as well as what is or done. It might be gestures or postures. The second constraint is on relations, so it's the relationship of the people to each other. Is one a boss and the other an employee, or a parent and a child, or a professor and a student, and those have, or a judge and a plaintiff. They have obvious power relationships based on the relationship between the interlocutors. And then on the subject positions that people can occupy. So some control is indirect and some is more direct. So the indirect is less obvious. It's not quite as clear, and the direct is a little bit easier for us to perceive. But this is what's interesting. I enjoy discourse analysis. I think it's a very interesting field to really stop and look at this, because there's so much to it that it really makes us more critical consumers of language in general. And this is a very important aspect of a person in society. And this ties in interestingly with the chapter 4 from the textbook, in that nowadays in the digital era, where we have the input of other types of media in our discourse, that it becomes quite complex, and it's easily manipulated if you're not a critical thinker. And as a consumer in the world, and not only a consumer of goods, but also of services and ideas and information. So for example, when you're watching the news, you're a consumer of that information. You're receiving it. So when we use discourse analysis, we can be more intelligent as to whether we accept things or not, whether we believe them or not, and in terms of forming our own opinions. So there's the interesting concept of the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper, as the name indicates, is someone who can bar entrance. So when you have a job interview with somebody, that person is a gatekeeper. If they recommend you to the hiring committee, then they can give you access to that job. If they don't recommend you, they might be the person to shut you down. Maybe you're an excellent candidate for the position, but if the selection is determined based upon their recommendation, you might not be able to get to the decision maker because this gatekeeper will stop you from getting there. That's just one example. There's plenty of examples where you have a gatekeeper. It might be somebody who's actually in like what we would assume to be a lower power position in terms of maybe socioeconomic status or job position. Let's say, for example, you want to get into a building after hours and there's a security guard there. So maybe you're the president of the company, but the security guard won't let you in because he's a gatekeeper. And so he has power in that interaction. Although in any other situation, like during business hours, he would certainly be the subordinate. So interestingly, sometimes people who are in lower power positions are enthusiastic about the opportunity to assert their power when that chance arises. There are some assumptions in these kinds of interactions. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying that case where a subordinate might be, we would call that power tripping. Yeah, I'm very
exactly. Yeah, that's the big man, the little man with the badge. Yes, that's what it is. Yeah, so we make some assumptions about people. We assume that they know how to interact in discourse in all of these different scenarios for interactions. So in the job interview, for example, there are certain discourse patterns, like usually the interviewer asks the questions and the interviewee must respond, and they must respond in a certain manner. They should respond concisely. They shouldn't go on for 10 minutes on one single response. They shouldn't give a lot of personal examples. They shouldn't talk about health issues, or in the United States, they shouldn't talk about being married or not, or having children or not. In the United States, that's considered irrelevant to the interviewee interviewing for the job. Whereas in other cultures, it's a norm that one would even put that information on their resume. So they might put their marital status. They might put their number of children on their resume. They might put their religion or their caste. And so things that are considered appropriate in one culture might be considered inappropriate in another in these discourse situations. And there's frequently miscommunication in discourse with second language speakers. And in our case, when we're looking at English language speakers, where English is not their first language. And so the assumption by the native speaker is that the non-native speaker should know these standards of interaction in the discourse. They should understand those unspoken, unwritten rules of how the discourse should occur. And the ironic thing is that the better the person speaks English as a second or a foreign language, the more the native speaker thinks that the non-native speaker should know and adhere to the rules. We might throw them a bone if their language is not as proficient, then us native speakers can make the assumption that perhaps they also don't dominate the culture. But when they dominate the language, there's even a higher assumption that they dominate the culture as well. So have you ever been in a situation like this, where that's happened to you, where you've had a situation with somebody who's power tripping and with any language barriers or cultural barriers that interfered with that gatekeeper type of situation?
No, I can't think of an example offhand. I'm sure I've experienced it. I mean, semi-related. I remember an instance at a job where somebody was talking about something that they assumed I didn't know about, but that's something I was pretty well versed in, and I felt it was a race thing because I was Black. They thought I didn't know. Yeah, that situation.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we can certainly make other assumptions too. So it's not necessarily just on country of origin or L1 or socioeconomic status. It can be based on color or any other set of variables, so where we can make assumptions about what people should or shouldn't be like, or should or shouldn't know. Obviously, assumptions always need to be checked. Like it's inevitable that humans tend to make assumptions, but it's a question of self-discipline to stop and check yourself and question your own assumptions. It's a very good practice to get into. So then let's talk a little bit about hidden power. So it's not always clear who's in the power. It's not always obvious. And that this power is certainly a commodity. Of course, if you're powerful, you can get certain kinds of results from that power. And the power can kind of be negotiated too. You might have some kinds of interactions with people where you can perhaps assert your power, or maybe they made some kind of assumption about you that you were not powerful for whatever reason, and then based on your response, where you show that you have the knowledge or the information or the experience to challenge their assumption, and so power can be negotiated as well. It's not set in stone, and it's not immutable. So there were two important vocabulary items there in that section of the chapter, and one was about causality. So it's who is represented as causing what to happen, obviously. So the causer, the person who is causing it to happen, or who is doing what to whom. And then the other important concept is about nominalization. Nominalization is a process of giving prominence to a word. So if you remember this from the 660 in grammar, when you take a word and you put it at the beginning of the sentence and make a noun out of it, you emphasize that word. So like, for example, in the sentence, I like to swim. But if you change it and say, swimming is enjoyable, you're nominalizing the word, the verb to swim. You made it into a gerund, and so therefore it occupies the subject position in the sentence. So it takes a more prominent role in the sentence, therefore it's more important. So I like to swim is emphasizing an activity that I enjoy. So there's a little bit more emphasis on the subject, which is the speaker. but when you take the verb and put it at the beginning, the emphasis is on the activity as opposed to the person. If we look at requests and power, so frequently those people who are in power have the opportunity to make requests. They can ask things or tasks or favors or gifts from people that are in lesser positions. And it's very interesting because they have a lot of language options that they can use with this. So when I think of power, the first thing I think of is somebody maybe making a request in a direct, straightforward, perhaps demanding tone because they're in a position of power, so they don't have to be nice to get stuff done. They can just ask and say or tell somebody and expect it to be done. But then there's all kinds of different language tropes that we can use that give a subtle difference in meaning. We can quite slightly change things. So not only the vocabulary, but the intonation as well. So if you have something like, instead of, give that to me, obviously with a, what do you call that verb tense? Where you demand something, it's an imperative, right? So if you use an imperative, and you just use the verb, and that's obviously very direct and quite rude, and we normally only use those in emergency situations or situations where we're angry or frustrated, or perhaps speaking with children or something where there's a very clear power distance. But you might use some modal verbs to change that, and so you might say something like, oh, could you please give that to me? Could you give that to me? Can you give that to me? Won't you give that to me? You might add other words. Oh, my friend, won't you give that to me? Or give that to me, won't you? With a tag question. So there are many, many different ways we might ask the exact same question. And each and every one has a slightly different implication. You might even do it without making a question. So you might say something like, oh, it's kind of chilly in here, which is an implication that the person in lower power distance should turn on the heat or close the window or something like that. It's not even a direct request. It's an indirect request. It's not even asking at all. So can you think of any similar examples like this, where maybe somebody in a power position gave some kind of indirect request to you?
I remember, well, maybe not the exact request, but the way that the request was put forth. I was at a job, and I was tardy to work, and like the boss sat me down and said, oh, I spoke to the supervisor, it's going to be okay that you were late, blah blah blah. Oh, by the way, we need this extra class taught, are you available? And I felt like I had to say yes.
Good point. Yeah, for sure. There are certain times where we don't feel like we actually have the option to deny the request. Right? They might ask in a very polite way, but sometimes no is not an option, or at least we feel it isn't. You might lose your job, or risk angering somebody, or risk losing face, or there could be other consequences. So these are obviously very important linguistic elements to take into consideration when teaching language. It's not simply the grammar. You can't just focus on, okay, so here's how we make questions. We invert and put the verb before the subject, and we used a question formation instead of subject, verb, object. We'll add an auxiliary verb first before the subject, or we can use modal verbs. And then we talk about, degrees of politeness. So can, could, would, will, in terms of making requests. So that's one thing, but then we also need to think about putting it into context, and this context of who's making the request, and the situation in which it occurs, not only the people who are interacting, but in the physical context. Now, these are certainly important pieces of information for anybody who is in an EFL settings or ESL setting where they're trying to use their language in a new cultural context. These are things that you kind of need to be told unless you're very perceptive. I think you've probably already done the 536 where you do that test where you see what your personality type is. And so there are certain personality types that are very perceptive of their environments, and they know, like they're really good at paying attention to cues of others. If the other looks to feel uncomfortable, or if they're signaling something with body gesture or eye contact or something like that. And then there are other people who are kind of oblivious to that are just in their own world. So these people, they won't pick up on these extra linguistic indicators as easily as people who are very sensitive to them. So we as language teachers kind of need to point out what those physiological indicators might be. And those, of course, can be different from culture to culture. We all know that eye contact is something that's different from culture to culture. In some cultures, it's normal to look people in the eyes, and you can look them in the eyes for longer. And in other cultures, it's very aggressive, and you should avert your gaze. And these are things that are usually not taught and usually not discussed unless you clearly violate them in some egregious way. Then somebody might give you a tip and say, hey, look, we don't talk to people like that here, or we don't speak to our elders in such a way, and give you some social context. But that's kind of the fun part of language. I think it's super interesting. So looking a little bit at standard British English and how that evolved, that was kind of interesting. So Fairclough, he's very, very much into economics and how economics affects power distance. So he talks a lot about the bourgeoisie and the merchant class and the capitalists, and how the capitalists rise to the top and they become the nobles and they control the power. And they try and maintain positions of power, of course, as people in power always do. Nobody wants to give it up because it's good, right? If you're in power, you get all the luxury, you get everything, you get to make the requests, you get to have people do things for you. And so life in general tends to be a bit easier. So normally people don't like to give that stuff up. So he talks about how the capitalists rise to power and try and maintain that power. So it's kind of interesting in terms of what we think of as standard English and how that occurred. We never really stop to think about it. We think about, the Queen's English, standard British English. The Queen's English can also be referred to as RP, which is received pronunciation, which is the standard pronunciation for British English. But where did that come from? And he kind of traces the history of it and shows how it came from the capitalist class and the merchant. Sorry, I dropped for a sec. So English kind of slowly squeezed Latin and French and other dialects out of the way and became the standard. So speaking the standard had, it works both ways. It has access to power and it helps to maintain positions of power. So you can identify social groups according to the dialect or the type of pronunciation that they use. You can easily identify somebody. So for example, the Cockney accent in London, or the East Inders accent in London is totally different from the Queen's English or received pronunciation or BBC pronunciation, which it became known as later on. Cockney accent is associated with blue-collar workers. So just by speaking that dialect, we can make assumptions about somebody in terms of their socioeconomic status, the job that they might have, and the neighborhood in which they might live, and so therefore the type of house they might have, the type of education they might have. So we can make all kinds of assumptions based on the dialect or the accent or the substandard in quotes English that they use. So this is obviously a value judgment. It's a value judgment of the language. Objectively speaking, there is no one better pronunciation than another, and there is no one better English than another, and there is no one better language than another. I mean, languages are a device for communication, and it's something that's particularly rare to the human species. We're learning more and more and finding that other mammals perhaps do have communication much more so than we had initially thought. But objectively speaking, any pronunciation shouldn't matter, because what's important is the communication between humans. But we certainly do associate a judgment and a value estimation of language, and then therefore the speakers of that language based on the variety that they speak.
Dr. Julia, I've lost the screen share.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. Sorry about that. Go ahead and interrupt me whenever I'm tripping and we lost it. I didn't even realize when I came back in after I lost my after I got kicked out. Okay, so did you get to see that slide? Sorry. And I don't know why they're kind of scooted down. Yeah, it spins for a sec. So I apologize about this. I don't know why the words are kind of falling off the slide here. In my version that I'm looking at on my laptop, it's just fine. For some reason, the way it's coming up on my computer.
I don't see it. I've got a black screen.
Black screen?
Yeah,
okay,
black screen.
Unshare. Let's see. Oh, okay. And then just is it showing now or not?
No, still not showing.
Darn it. So I think what I'm going to have to do is log out and log back in, because it's not allowing me to stop share. So hold on just one sec.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Oh, there we go. It did stop share. Let me try one more time before I log in. Okay. Okie dokie, let's try again. How's that?
I see your phone. I don't see the slide just yet.
Okay. Do you see it?
Okay, it's coming up.
Okay, awesome. So I was saying, I'm sorry, for some reason on my phone, the words, at least to me, are falling off the slide, but when I look at it on my computer, the alignment is fine. So I hope when I upload it for you on Blackboard, you'll be able to see it fine.
Yeah, it's off the screen here too, but that's okay.
Okay, all right. So I talked a little bit about the difference between the in the medical staff in the medical examination for example, it was kind of interesting in this article. He goes into depth about an analysis of a conversation in a gynecological exam. So obviously, like, a super powered different position, like the woman is totally vulnerable there on the table and kind of in an awkward or perhaps uncomfortable situation, or not. I mean, might just have become routine for the woman as well, but there's some interesting social norms that are assumed that we should follow in these situations, like you should avert your gaze, that it would be rather aggressive to look into the doctor's eyes in this situation, and some interesting language norms that should occur in this context. I'm going to skip along and kind of move forward because we have a lot to cover. So rather than watch that video and ask questions, I'll just move on. There's a really interesting section in this chapter talking about access to discourse. So for certain professions, obviously, a lot of prerequisite knowledge is required in order to be able to conduct certain kinds of discourse. So they gave, for example, the role of a preacher or a priest, or irregardless of the religion, that the person would need to have certain knowledge, expertise in their area, maybe certain study, diploma, or had been to certain schools, and have to show certain moral characteristics as well, like to be trustworthy and honest and able to keep a secret. And so some different issues that would allow one to hold these positions, to be able to reach these positions. So you might actually think of the situational context as being the gatekeeper that allows certain people to be able to get into these positions or not. So Fairclough quotes Foucault, who says that any system of education is a political way of maintaining or modifying appropriation of discourse along with the knowledge and powers which they carry. So basically, education and formal education and a diploma can legitimize access to certain power positions and therefore types of discourse. So obviously with doctors, for example, it takes 13 years of study minimum to become a doctor. But some things that we don't think about is that perhaps certain people even get to the opportunity to be able to spend 13 years in school to start with. They have to have a certain amount of luxury to be able to study for 13 years without having to work and support themselves along the way. So it's difficult to imagine somebody going through medical school while they're working full time. So they most likely come from a family position that allows them to be supported while they study, which helps to kind of propagate this system in which we legitimize the power and discourse of a certain class. So this is all part of Fair Clause argument about how the upper classes maintain their power and their position. And education is a way of legitimizing that power, and the discourse can help to maintain that position of power. Formality can also restrict access to discourse. So we have certain norms in society in terms of how we should speak to certain people, and even if we can approach them or not. So we might not even dare to bother the president of the company, or the queen, or somebody in a position of royalty, or some executive, because of these restrictions of formality. It would be considered rude to just walk up to somebody like that and initiate a conversation, whereas it's not rude to do that with a colleague or a peer or somebody in a lower power position. So let's think about this in terms of classroom activities. And I'm sure at this point in time in your TESOL career, you've already seen the instructional conversation with Dr. Lin. Have you had a chance to have that, to run into that, the instructional conversation?
No, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, because you do mostly online courses. So Dr. Lin is somebody who kind of focuses on this a lot. But the instructional conversation is a technique that she uses to teach people to get their turn in conversation. So you set up what's called a fishbowl, and you have like a group of no more than 8 students maximum, and you give them a prompt. And the prompt is like a little scenario or situation that should be somewhat provocative. And because, I mean, provocative in terms, not sexually necessarily, but in terms of enticing people to interact and to form an opinion and state something about it. And it's usually situated around university students or intercultural communication, or something that would be relevant to our MA TESOL students. And so you might have some kind of situation where, like, you have 2 roommates, and one of them wants to go out with a different group of friends, and she doesn't want to invite her roommate to go out with her. But the other roommate's always kind of shy, and so the roommate who wants to go out without the other feels kind of obliged to invite the other, but doesn't want to, and so she invents a little white lie so that she can go out with her friends without having to call the roommate. And so you kind of leave this unfinished situation, and then you invite students to participate in a conversation. What would you do in that situation? You don't really give them very specific questions, but you just allow them to come up with their own conversation about it. And this is all an opportunity to teach people about turn taking in the classroom and what happens automatically. So there's this kind of interesting dynamic that will show up where typically the white males will dominate the conversation. Like, they've got no qualms about jumping in and giving their opinion and stating what they would do and what they think is right, or how they would handle the situation. They're the first ones to jump in. And then usually the native speakers also dominate the conversation, and the non-native speakers, and particularly people from different locations. So perhaps the Asians or the Saudis might feel, or maybe not, you know, it also depends on certain personality issues too. So obviously that's a vast generalization. So you might have some Asians or Saudis that are very outspoken just by their personality, but in broad terms, that kind of dynamic develops. So then we get an opportunity to kind of take a step back and break it apart and see what happened, and say, oh, look who, you know, jumped in and dominated. So we're kind of trying to teach those people who dominate the conversation how to give the other person an opportunity to speak, because they themselves don't even realize that they tend to dominate the conversation. it's just the way that they have always conducted themselves, just out of habit and out of culture, and that's what they've learned that they can and should do. And so it creates a very interesting opportunity for an analysis of culture and language in the classroom. So we teach the outgoing people to kind of police themselves and give others an opportunity. And then we also teach the shyer, quieter, more introverted people from cultures that are not as assertive, and perhaps those who don't feel as confident about their language, about English particularly. We teach them how to get a turn, how to be assertive. So there's these techniques that you can use, like by using eye contact. So if there's somebody who's dominating the conversation, the person who wants to get a turn needs to look the speaker in the eye. And then when they get the eye contact, then you can kind of jump in. But if they never look in your eye, they're never going to give up their turn. You can use body language by leaning forward. Of course, there are certain phrases that you can use, like, well, disagree, or, oh, I'd like to add on, or, you know, certain chunks of discourse that we teach students how to use. So it's super important for us as language teachers to be very aware of the fact that there's the tendency for that natural dynamic. And if we don't teach students how to behave differently, it will continue that way. And not only in the classroom, but outside of the classroom as well. The kind of influence on power structures in language, we have to teach, or power structures in society, we have to teach students how to use language in order to obtain turns, and then therefore perhaps more equality in their conversations and in their interactions. So wrapping up about this chapter, again, there was a main concept of the difference between power over discourse and power behind discourse. And just one second, I want to just go back to the article and take a look. Yeah, that's the incorrect preposition. I thought it was. It's power in discourse, not over. That's wrong. I need to make a change there. I'll change that later. So it's power in discourse. So the power in discourse is what already occurs at the situational level, and how that that power kind of plays out through examining the discourse itself. And then the power behind the discourse is what's going on behind the scenes. It's not necessarily so obvious. So let's see if we have time. Take a look at these questions real quick and see if we want to tackle these.
Dr. Julie, am I on the right slide? The slide says power and excess. Oh, the slide now says final thoughts.
Oh, that was a lag. Okay, I'm glad you see it. Yeah, so do you see where it's bolded there and it says power over discourse? That's incorrect. It should be power in discourse.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, power over discourse would be a whole nother thing. It would be having the ability to dictate how discourse occurs. So perhaps as like a news agency or something, you might be able to control through propaganda how the discourse shows power. So this article was, as I said, was written in the late 70s. He talks about the Falkland Islands, you know, like some events that were happening way back then that certainly aren't relevant for today's students unless they know their history. But do you think that this article still is relevant in this day and age? Do you think that some of these concepts that we talked about are important still? And do you think that the power difference between the the merchant class or the capitalist class and the bourgeois is the same as it was in the 70s, or do you think that there's more equity nowadays and equality, or what's your opinion on that?
When I read the article, I didn't feel it was very dated. Like, I mean, like the example that he talked about with the student talking to the police officer, I felt was still really relevant to today. The gynecological example of how a doctor and the power dynamics of the doctor over the woman when she's in an office being examined, I felt that was still really relevant today. And then all the stuff about the working class and the bourgeoisie class and all that stuff, I feel it's still relevant. I feel it still applies.
Yeah, so pretty interesting how change is so slow to come along, right? So that was, let's see, almost in the 80s. So 40 years later, perhaps not a lot has changed. So it's kind of interesting testament to humanity and to power positions in humanity and in society, that they're pretty rigid, and for obvious reasons that people don't really want to give those up. So it's certainly interesting. And so do you think that language teachers have a dog in this fight? Do you think that they should become involved in terms of educating students about obtaining equity and equal opportunity and rights? Or is that something that's better that left outside of the language classroom?
Oh no, I think it definitely applies to language teachers because it's part of communication. So it's relevant. Like this is a semi-related example, but I remember seeing like a meme going around about what teachers should say to students, what they should say instead of what they do say. Like for example, instead of saying we don't talk like that, a teacher should say something like, can you use kinder words? And I think that word choice, that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very nice. There's it's interesting because he's talking about how the power structure helps to maintain power. But I think the example that you just gave is very interesting, because with kindness and understanding and like an open heart and a willingness to teach about these societal norms, perhaps you could even argue that that's a very strong kind of power, because, and not in an egoistic sense of domination, of dominating another person, but in the sense that it has a very strong influence on somebody's potential growth and development in their life. So it's actually a position of strength, and power doesn't always need to be equated with domination and force and being rude. And that's one way of thinking about power, and I think that's the traditional concept of it. But perhaps in a more equally distributed society where people are not afraid to share power, it doesn't mean that when the underdog receives power that the powerful person loses power. Perhaps there's an argument that we all might be powerful. All right, so let's get into our other chapter, which I felt was like a little bit more dense than the Fairclough, and Fairclough is known for being pretty dense. So let's try and just get to kind of the nuts and bolts of this chapter. And I agree with you that it merits a second and third reading to be able to fully digest it. So let's kind of just treat this as perhaps a first run through, and just to kind of highlight the most important points and food for thought, and then perhaps reread it and go back for a deeper understanding of this article, so, or of this chapter. So the argument that the author is making in this chapter is that, and I talked about this a little bit last week, about being in a post-method era, and that meaning that in language teaching that we're kind of beyond the methods. So if you study the history of English language teaching methodology, and it started like way back in maybe the 1500s with the grammar translation method, or perhaps even before that, where the intelligentsia would study languages in general in order for library languages to be able to read in another language. They really didn't use it for speaking, but they wanted to go back and read the classics. So they would study Latin and Greek so that they could read the original works of famous authors and philosophers and religious works. And so they basically focused on the written word and translating it from the old language, from the classic language to the modern languages. And then there were several other different methods. We talked a little bit about audiolingual method last class and how that was based on behaviorism. And so it was based on repetition and focus on pronunciation. And that was kind of like in the 1950s, around World War II, when it was really important to be good at pronunciation. But the writing wasn't as important. So in grammar translation, it was mainly an ESP, an English for the specific purpose, of reading and writing. It was really for reading, but the practice was done through writing of classic languages. Whereas the audiolingual method was an oral method, and it focused on oral production, and particularly on flawless, error-free production, error-free in terms of grammar as well as pronunciation. And then in the 1970s and 80s, there was this whole slew of what we called the designer method. So there were all these different theories that came up. And remember that our theories about language teaching kind of go hand in hand with our theories about psychology. So we talked about how the audiolingual method came up in the 50s by no accident, because the predominant psychological theory at that point in time was behaviorism. And so the idea behind behaviorism is that you can create specific behaviors in animals, people being an animal as well, based on reward and punishment and repetition. And so you could be, language is also seen as a behavior. So you can inculcate language behaviors through behavior, through reward, punishment, and repetition. With the
Dr. Julie, sorry to interrupt. I'm hearing you just fine, but I'm still on the first slide. Is that correct?
Yes, I didn't move on yet.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No problem. That's okay. Let me put the next one so you can kind of start to read through it. They're a little bit dense to go hand in hand with the dense chapter, but yeah, these are kind of dense slides. So with the designer methods in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and maybe even 80s. So like in the 1960s, you had a more humanistic approach to psychology, and we were looking at human potential. And you have Maslow's pyramid. So on the base, are you familiar with Maslow's pyramid?
Yeah, I remember it from a class a few quarters ago. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to explain it, but it's in the back of my brain somewhere.
Okay, perfect. So what he says is that we have to meet our basic needs. So if you meet your needs for food, shelter, warmth, relationship, friendship, like basic things in life, like then as you kind of move up on the pyramid, and once you've met your basic needs, then when you get higher up, then you can come to what we call self-actualization or self-realization. So once you have all your basic needs, and you've got a job, and you've got food, and you've got a home, and you don't need to worry about scraping to survive, then you can focus on more personal goals and personal development just for fun and evolution and personal intellectual and spiritual growth. And so the idea was that learning a second language was, if it was not for work, it could be for those kinds of needs. So it was seen as like a free time activity, and we focused more on interest and motivation and desire and some other psychological variables. So, but after all of that, and there were maybe, I don't know, 6 or so different designer methods. And then we came into the era of the communicative approach. So that started in the late 70s, 80s, and went along for quite some time until the 90s and 2000s, and it's still kind of important. But we argued that nowadays we're in what we call the post-method era, which means that there is no one method that's considered to be the best language teaching method. Like, not after all is said and done, and we tried all of these like 10, 15 different methods that came up, and there were some after the designer methods, we realized that there's not one way to learn a language, that they all have their pros and cons, as with everything in life. And the conclusion was that we could kind of pick and choose from the different methods. That obviously some were better for learning writing, and some were better for reading, and some were better for pronunciation, and some were better for speaking, and some were better for focusing on vocabulary. And they all had their own pros and cons. And so similarly, the author of this chapter is trying to argue that we're also in what is called a post-linguistic era. And they kind of say that like tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of silly because obviously we still have language, so it's not like we're beyond language like the name implies. But he's saying that it's all relative. It's all relative to the situation. So we still have, you know, the basics of linguistics, of morphology, syntax, phonology, etc. But that you can't study any of those in isolation. It's all related to context. So like we talked about earlier with the modal verbs and intonation in terms of making a request. So if you take the situation into consideration, that might affect the syntax that you use, certainly affects the pragmatics. So it's relative to specific language communities or situations or the people in terms of the power discourse. So let's look at this quote down here at the bottom by Kress. Oh, you can't see that, that's off the screen. I'll read it to you. It says, language alone cannot give us access . Hi, that again. So. Okay, can you see my screen? It's probably spinning.
No, not yet.
Okay, is it
It's
a black
still black
screen?
for me.
All right.
Okay, there we go.
Sweet. Okay, very cool. So he brings in the concept of multimodality. And what that means is that now with the era of technology is there's a lot of media that also influences language. So obviously we have radio, television, movies, internet, YouTube, Facebook, and obviously this has all affected language, right? It has spread English around the globe. It has spread English language culture around the globe, English language or American values or Western values around the world. And so with the media And this is what we call multimodality. The modality refers to various types of media. So like, for example, I'm asking students in this course to do a multimodal presentation on one of the chapters. So that means that there's various forms of media. So you're using the text, you might have hyperlinks to other web links or examples, or you're supposed to include voice or perhaps video or graphics or infographics or photos. So all of these influence discourse. And photos, for example, are also considered linguistic. Like they're an image and they're a symbol and a symbol of something that elicits language in your mind. So when you see an image, you have thoughts as a result of that image that you see. So not that that didn't always exist, but in the era of technology, it has become much more prominent. So we really need to think of that in terms of language and language teaching. So it made language teaching easier on the one hand, because we have a lot of resources that we can bring to the classroom and examples, and there are studies that show that students retain information much better when it's associated with images, and particularly moving images. So if you have videos, it's obviously more entertaining. It requires quite a bit of discipline to dissect a text like this chapter and to be able to understand it and look words up in the dictionary and analyze what the referent is, what are the pronouns referring to, and to really break down the language. So this, the emphasis on multimodality has facilitated, as well as has made language teaching perhaps more complex in certain ways. So beyond the post-method era, we have to look at this situation of integrational linguistics. So integrating all of these different linguistic features from different areas and people and accents, as well as with multiliteracies. So different types of literacies, like being able to read SMS text messages, all the way up to very difficult, dense chapters and theoretical articles and scientific production. And so this has come about, the technology has caused globalization, where it's the spread of Western culture and values, basically. Although Westerners also now have access to other cultures that were closed off to them before as well too. So it's not only Western domination, but still the majority of the information on the internet is English. When the internet first came out, it was 99%, if not 100, at the very beginning in English. And then slowly, with the advent of other keyboards, we had information in other languages. Now it's probably like around 60%, 65% of the information on the internet is in English, which is a huge change from 99%. There's a lot of information available now in other languages. But this globalization has caused what the author calls mediation. And so you have to be careful, because it's not mediation in as to mediate between two people. That would mean to be the go-between in conversation, to help two people understand. Like if you have a mediator come to kind of be the referee in a conversation. So it's not that sense. It's the sense that media, in terms of technological media, particularly the internet and video, have influenced discourse. So talking a little bit more about integrational linguistics. So the linguistic sign cannot function alone as the basis on independent and self-sufficient communication. It depends on the integrations with nonverbal activities of many different kinds. So it's kind of taking into consideration everything we've talked about in terms of rules of discourse, power, situation, the people involved, the influence of the media. He brings in the important concept of semiotics. And so semiotics is the interpretation of signs and symbols. So like, let's take, for example, a tool such as a shovel. So when you look at a shovel, you think of digging into the earth and what it can be used for. But you don't necessarily think of where it came from and who developed it and how it's been used along the centuries. And this tool has been handed down to us and we understand how to use it. Our forefathers created it for us and our foremothers, and created lots of cultural artifacts that we use in our day-to-day life now that have a lot of meaning associated with them. And so this is, you don't need to negotiate it. It's understood. I know what a shovel is used for, so do you. Perhaps we could use it in some creative way, like to keep the door closed or something like that. It might have some alternative uses, but it has this rich history associated with it. And so this is kind of, in a nutshell, what semiotics is. So language is also a tool. It's a tool that was developed by humanity. And the words are symbols that represent ideas, and ideas are abstract concepts. So if you think of words like a shovel or a sewing machine or a knife or something like that, that they are tools, and in general, we assume that the other person knows what we mean when we use that symbol and what we refer to. But we can't be sure, because when I use the word chair, maybe I've got an armchair in my mind. And when I say it to you, maybe you think of a chair with, like a regal chair with a high back and made of wood. And I'm thinking of a big cushy soft one. So it's a little bit more abstract than physical tools that we find in our environment. So let's go down to the question first here. In your opinion, what is proficiency? Is it purely based on linguistic features, or does it involve more in this age of globalization, mass communication, and EIL?
Proficiency in speaking English?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely is more. It includes, like we talked about, like being aware of power dynamics, of register, of the situation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome. So exactly. So it comes into this creative use of panoply of semiotic resources. So like the speech, the text, the images, social conventions, memories, even feelings, and how to make language. So memory is highly subjective, highly subjective. And so by extension, language might also be quite subjective in terms of communication is a process of negotiation. What I intend to say is not always necessarily, and probably not usually necessarily, understood directly by the other person. It's work of going back and forth to come to an agreement in terms of meaning. And this is an indication of proficiency, is this ability to be able to have this interaction and this negotiation of meaning. It's part of proficiency. So what do you think about some types of new media, such as blogs and websites? And how do you think that affects the creation of meaning? in terms of, these are new types of written discourse that didn't exist 15 years ago, let's say, being generous. Do you think that that has affected our notions of language?
I'm sorry, repeat the question one more time, Dr. Julie. I didn't fully follow.
Sure. Yeah, sorry, maybe it wasn't clear. So when you think of new types of writing that have occurred, because all of the examples that I gave so far were more like visual images and audio images. So I talked a lot about video and YouTube and pictures and films. But what about new types of writing that have emerged on the internet? So for like example, blogs, and maybe like Facebook posts or Instagram posts, for example. How would you say that those affect this negotiation of meaning?
How does it affect the negotiation of meaning?
Right. So I was just talking about how conversation is negotiation of meaning. When we're talking, you can't assume that, or I as a speaker cannot assume that you understand what I'm saying. And we go back and forth, just as we are right now. I made a question that wasn't clear, so you asked for clarification. So I reiterated, and it wasn't clear. So that's another question, right? So we're going back and forth to try and get clarity, you know. And it's also a process of me getting clear in my own head of the question that I'm trying to ask of you. This happens in conversation all the time, right? Where people kind of work out ideas as they're speaking. It might not be crystal clear in their own mind, much less in the person that they're speaking to. So I was talking about oral communication and negotiation of meaning in oral communication. And I also talked about how visual and video images in multimodality have influenced communication and language. What about the influence of written communication with technology? So written communication, would you agree, has Sorry, I'm just gonna So did you get my question?
Sorry, we cut off a little bit. So you're asking how does this written communication, how is it? Okay, no, I didn't get the question.
Would you agree that written communication has changed with technology? Is it different now than it was 20 years ago? Are there new genres that have appeared?
Okay, yes, I agree. Like you mentioned blogs and such, and like Facebook posts. One thing, it just seems like the information is a lot more accessible to people. But I guess what I keep thinking about though is that because it's one-sided. There's not a lot of room for like to clarify what's being said. Also, I don't know why I keep thinking about this, but I also keep thinking about how what's written we accept as true and as fact, and we don't question it because it's written down. Whereas in conversation, maybe we can have a discussion and negotiation of what the meaning is.
Absolutely. And do you think that that has always been true, or is that a new development with technology?
I kind of feel like it's always been true, but even more so now. I guess I'm thinking about this because I just taught a class about what was it about? I don't remember, but one of the points in the class was talking about how when we critically read something, we have to be sure that we question what is the author's intention, who is he talking to, what's his motivation, and just because it's written down doesn't mean we have to accept it as fact and as 100% true. And I think that's a big problem these days, especially people become lazy to read. If something's too long, they're not going to read it. I think that's why Facebook posts are so so popular, and some blog posts are usually pretty short, and that's why they're so popular, and they just accept it as true in fact, and they don't critically think about it, and they don't do more research beyond it.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I agree with you that it's always been there, and but perhaps people have become a little bit more aware of it because of the increase in perhaps what we consider less credible sources. So I think that like newspapers and books were seen as being authoritative publications. So when we talked about power distance in discourse, so discourse can be written as well. Up till now, we've been talking about oral discourse mainly, and we talked about the doctor's speech, etc., and how positions and job interviews and how positions of power can be maintained in oral discourse. And in written discourse, just by being published, it was an authoritative statement. So you had gatekeepers, which were the publishing houses. And so they were responsible for the vast majority of publications of books and newspapers and magazines until the advent of the internet, except for perhaps personal letters or poetry or things that people would write. But those generally weren't for mass consumption. In order to be produced for mass consumption, it had to be produced through the printing press to reach a lot of people. And so publications traditionally had a very strong sense of authority that generally was not questioned. And then with the advent of the internet and the fact that anybody could publish on the internet, then you had less credible sources that started to flourish. And so perhaps people have started to develop the habit of questioning more written production than they used to in the past. And it's certainly a very important practice to teach our students in terms of critical thinking and to think about who produced the piece of writing, who funded the research, who is the intended audience, who is the intended consumer of the information. And it's a very important consideration in this concept of what we call multiliteracies. So multiliteracy is being able to read all of these different genres and understand them for what they are and how they were created and for whom they were created. So it's something interesting to cogitate. There's a lot of information there to take into consideration and a lot of food for thought. And I certainly do feel like it has affected language and communication and teaching. So we just have a couple minutes left, so I'm just going to jump down to the bottom here. And so let me ask you this last question. And so we've established the concept of multiliteracies and these different genres that have become available with technology and different varying levels of authority with the publications. So how do these notions of multiliteracies, and particularly practically, and possibly affect traditional goals of language teaching, such as accuracy, fluency, and appropriateness? So in the past, we could say that traditional language teaching focused on accuracy and fluency, and perhaps appropriateness, which are those social situations that affect when to use what form of the language. So do you think that multiliteracy has had effects on those traditional teaching goals?
I'm sorry, Dr. Julia, I need you to rephrase because you said a lot there.
Yeah, absolutely. So trying to make it a little bit shorter and clearer. do you understand the concept of multiliteracy?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So do you think that the concept of multiliteracy has influenced the traditional goal of teaching accuracy, fluency, and appropriateness?
I'm gonna say yes. Okay, multiliteracy. Let me make sure I understand it. Multiliteracy as like these different ways of these. Sorry. Um. Uh. Okay. No. I'm sorry, Dr. Julie. Explain multiliteracy to me.
Mm-hmm. So it's all of these different types of, well, let's just break it down. What is literacy?
Okay, literacy is the what is known about a subject. Okay, like the literacy is yeah, all the stuff that we know about something, right?
So what does it mean to be illiterate?
Is when you don't understand something, or when you can't read.
Exactly. Not that you don't understand, it's that you don't know how to read. It's the ability to read the written word, right, is when somebody is illiterate. So therefore, literacy is?
Okay, so that when you can read.
Exactly. And multi means?
When you can read lots of different things. So you mean when you can read like newspapers and blogs and Facebook posts and books?
There you go, exactly. Multiliteracy is the ability to read all of these different things, including symbols, including pictures, graphics, images. So it's not just the written word, but sounds, colors, all of these choices. It's visual images and being able to read and interpret those. So if you think of an infographic or something, it's being able to read and digest and understand that.
Okay, I got you. Hit me with the question.
All right. So do you think that multiliteracy has affected language teaching? Let's just put it that way.
Okay, I think yes, because then I think a learner has multiple opportunities to try and understand a concept because they're presented it in many different ways.
Okay, so in that sense, what you just said, it's a positive, right? It's become helpful because there are many different opportunities for understanding, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. But would you also perhaps argue the other side, that maybe it's made it more complicated as well?
I think yes, because then you might get conflicting information about something. So it maybe the student might be confused of which one to believe, which one they should follow. But then I think that's where critical thinking comes into play.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's more to consider. We have a lot more options. We have a lot more thrown at us. There's a lot more information, period. A lot more channels and avenues through which we can get information. But absolutely, so if you bring in the other skills of critical and creative thinking, then we can teach people how to make decisions as to whether they're going to agree or disagree or believe with that which they read. All right, so awesome. So that's that chapter in a nutshell. Those are the major concepts. So now that you understand multiliteracy, that's helpful, and thinking about these notions of language and discourse, and there's some other concepts in there, but like going through the methods and I think that the bottom line is, how has all of this affected language teaching in this post-linguistic era? So post-linguistic is we're beyond the basic written word, that there's so much more to it that's influencing what we understand. And that tends to influence language teaching as well. So let me just say really quickly what's coming up in terms of assignments in the course and see if there's anything we need to focus on. So people have posted their keyword ideas, and I'll be responding to those right now. And please check in every day now for the next couple of days to see the feedback on the keywords until we come to an agreement by next Sunday. If anybody's having any difficulty and they would like to set up a time for a one-on-one Zoom session where we can discuss your topic, we can do that too, because sometimes it's just quick and easy to do a little brainstorming session together and kind of arrive at your keywords. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time if we're going back and forth by text, and sometimes we can get to the point a little bit faster if we have a conversation. So I'll respond to those right now and check in and see how we're doing. And then I think we're pretty good because that's all that's due by the end of this week. And then next week, you need to start your annotated bibliography summaries. That can't be started until we've agreed upon your keywords. So wait until you get approval. I'll put it in the wiki once we get to a mutually agreed upon set of keywords. Then I'll put approved, and then you're ready to go ahead and start doing your library research to start generating the articles that you will be using for your annotated bibliography, which are the notes that you are taking that you will use to write your lit review. So just remembering that you need to find 15 articles once we decide on your keywords that you're going to kind of summarize to use to write your lit review. And slowly each week you're going to hand in like 2 or 3 annotated bibliographies. And basically that's just a little summary of the articles that you read for that week. So you do some research in the library, you find some articles that seem relevant to your topic, you summarize those in a paragraph or 2, and you put the APA citation at the top. I'll provide feedback and send it back to you. And then the following week, you'll resubmit, you'll correct, make any corrections that are necessary in the annotated bibliography from the previous week, and add on 2 more for the next submission. So we'll work back and forth until you've got an annotated bibliography with 10 submissions. You don't need to annotate all of the 15 articles. I'm only asking you to do 10. But you do need to cite 15 articles in your paper, but you need to submit 10 of the annotations to me and your annotated bibliography. The annotated bibliography is something that you need to save for your outcomes assessment portfolio, so please be sure to save that because you'll want to submit that later. And next week, I'll talk a little bit about the keyword map. Basically, that's just a graphic representation of the structure of your lit review. You're just showing me what's your major topic and the breakdown of those topics. I'll get into more detail on that next week so as to not overload you. Any other questions?
No questions. Thank you, Dr. Julie.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, and pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for your participation and for having read the content and being ready for the conversation. So have a lovely week, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.